looking at present tense use quiz. And number 1 was explain the following statement with reference to aspect. The present tense is internal. And the explanation that Wallace gives is it portrays the action from inside the event. To add to that, you could say without special regard for beginning or end, makes no comment as to fulfillment or completion. Number 2, what is the unaffected meaning of the present tense? That is ongoing or continuous action. What are the 3 factors that make up the affected meaning of any tense? So that would be the pragmatic meaning. That's lexical, contextual, and grammatical factors. Then you are asked to match the tense use and definitions to statements. So I'll just read the number and the letter. 4 is F, 5 is D, 6 is I, 7 is C, 8 is E, 9 is H, 10 is G, and 11 is J.
There's 12, 13.
12 and 13, thank you. 12 is A, 13 is J, and 14 is B. Any questions about those items? All right, so moving on to 15. Let's see if we can get this a little larger. There we go, number 15. Le erchome tachu. Yes, I am coming quickly. The use is futuristic. He hasn't come. He said that back in about 90 AD. So he's referring to the future. And it's like Aslan says to Lucy, she asks him, what do you mean by soon? And he says, I call all time soon.
Which book is that in?
I think that's in Prince Caspian.
Oh, okay.
Number 16, of to epsato ke legiavto, he touched him and is saying to him. So here is clearly a historical present and probably historical progressive because what he says is long enough to involve some progress in time. Number 17, pandas zetusin, all men are seeking you. I would take that as just a descriptive statement of they're looking for you right now, progressive. Number 18, aparkes o diabolos amertani. From the beginning, the devil is sinning, your classic example of a durative. So you have the contextual basis for the durative from the beginning. The action is happening. Ilaron gardote agapa otheos. God loves a cheerful giver. And I would assume that that's gnomic, that it's true at all times. And therefore, the present tense was used to communicate that gnomic idea. And let's see, talking about our 3 factors in which we triangulate the pragmatic meaning, this is not a function of lexical meaning because love is not inherently gnomic.
Okay.
It's not a function of grammatical because this is the indicative mood. There's no grammatical constraint. It's a function of context in the sense of the actor of the subject. Since God is eternal, and what we know about Otheos is that what he does, what is true about him, as part of his nature, we would expect to be always true. That's what generates the gnomic here, the context, and specifically the actor in the context.
No, I had gnomic. It seems to me like there can be, maybe, is it possible for a gnomic to portray a truth that's timeless in the sense of, like, the universe is true of pre-glorification state, you know? I mean, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah, I don't think gnomic has to necessarily mean eternal. If that's is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, no, it doesn't necessarily mean eternal.
Yeah.
Within the current time frame. And number 20, dia puon avton ergon emelethadzeta. On account of which of these works are you stoning me? That could either be progressive or it could be conative, though Wallace gives this as the example of a conative. They're attempting to do it. We don't really know enough about the situation to know for sure whether that's truly conative or just actually progressive.
You mean like they could be actually throwing stones?
Yeah, maybe somebody just thrown a stone and he's saying, why, on account of which of these works are you stoning me? Yeah. Okay, so the number correct at the top there. I will bring this in later, but let me just mention it here. I was reading an Evangelical Theological Journal, and Al Walters wrote an article on the use of the verb alphanteo in 1 Timothy 2. I suffer not a woman to exercise authority, alphanteo. And he was looking at its uses in astrological texts contemporary with the New Testament, because those are the only kind of texts where the word occurs. And, it talks about such and such a planet ruling over other planets and so on. But at the end of his article, he says, we have a question before us. Does this verb in 1 Timothy 2 refer to the beginning of the action of ruling, which is called ingressive, the start, or does it refer to, does it have like a lexical nuance of tyranny or domination? And his response was, well, the answer is neither, because it's the aorist tense that has as part of its semantics ingressiveness, and the verb itself does not imply the ingress, the beginning of an action. And I was like, whoa, pull the brake cord on the train. You're telling me that the semantic content of the aorist tense, the unaffected meaning, is ingressive? Absolutely not. That's a purely pragmatic function. And it was like, Walters, haven't you read Wallace? Surely you have, but you talk like you haven't. Context determines ingressive versus constative versus culminative, these uses of the aorist tense, which we'll look at here soon. And not the semantics of the aorist itself. And so it's not so much that he's wrong about his conclusion as it's a case of assigning the data to the wrong place. And I think that's one of the benefits of the kind of study we're doing, is that when we come to say where I'm getting X piece of semantic data from, we don't hang the whole load on the tense form. We're looking much more broadly. And that will guard us from doing what James Barr calls, he has some big long fancy name for the idea of taking the meaning of a word in one context, the whole theological import of that context, and dumping it into that word in another context. So let's say, for example, we think about monogene. We theologize about the only begottenness of the Son of God, and then we turn over here to Luke 2 and see Jesus was Mary's only begotten Son. You can't dump that theological content in there, right? Well, it's the same thing happens, the same error that takes place in lexical studies takes place in grammatical studies. They dump all of the contextual, pragmatic meaning into the semantic container, so to speak, and then carry it wherever they go.
You mean even, so they're, by that, do you mean they're taking the affected meaning of the sentence and then trying to read that into unaffected?
Oh, no, they're taking the affected meaning in one place and then wanting to read it into the affected meaning in every other place.
And because each place is unique, it's going to affect it
differently, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I was struck as I read that. I think, man, and I know who Al Walters is. I've seen him at the conference, and as far as I know, he's a good scholar. But this is something. What it tells me is when you get your as the farther away from your education you get, the more likely it is that you are out of touch unless you make a deliberate effort to stay in touch with developments in the area of your education.
Is that what publishing is? Peer-reviewed journals?
Sure.
To kind of keep you up to date.
Keep you up to date. And, you know, I'm not a D.A. Carson who can read 80 journals in 3 months kind of a thing. Instead, I just keep my eye open in the fields that I have interest in because, you know, it may start in the journal articles, but it's going to wind up in the books. And you just keep poking in, well, what's being said, ooh, something different, something new. And usually there's a big enough splash if people think it's a big deal that you'll at least hear about it if you're listening.
Is that why seminaries have their own journals to keep their faculty members, you know?
No, I think the reason they do that is that two reasons. One reason is faculty members felt like they had something to say to their constituency that would be interested.
Constituency being?
Whoever they think will read their journal. Or they found it difficult to get published elsewhere. So you just start your own journal and get published, which is one reason why I don't think we should ever have a journal here.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, you're being unfairly, discriminated against. So some conservative institutions start their own journal because nobody would publish their conservative viewpoint. That's legit. Okay, do you have any questions about the present tense? Anything that you feel shaky about, uncertain about, would like clarification about?
Well, to be honest with you, this time around, I didn't spend 2 hours in class and study. Actually, what I did read was actually the introductory material. And
okay.
I didn't feel like I read through it well enough.
Any questions about that part then, introductory material?
I'm not sure there's any that's really terribly relevant. Peter and Brandon and I have, up till now, I don't know how long it will last, been getting together outside of class to try to have a unified front to come to you with stuff that we don't understand.
Sure.
And one of the things that's still somewhat confusing to us is what exactly aspect is. And, so what does it mean for, what is the content of aspect outside of its unaffected meaning? And that's really the only thing I can think of what is the content of aspect outside of its unaffected meaning? And that's really the only thing I can think of. And there's also something about I noticed that, which one was it? The historic present 16. He touched him in his saying on our quiz. It seems to me like, I don't know if you remember last time we had a discussion between whether historic can be in direct discourse, and I think you were saying something like historic is always and only in indirect discourse when it's a present tense. It's never direct discourse, and I was wondering about if you could,
I think at the end of that discussion, I mentioned that Greek indirect discourse always retains the tense of the direct discourse.
Yes.
And therefore...
And that's the reason it's using...
And the use then, since it's retaining the direct discourse tense's use, I would assume that we should understand the tense use in the indirect discourse as identical with the tense use in the direct discourse. So it's like this. He says, I am going to the store. And Greek says, he said that I am going to the store. So we ask, what is the tense use of am going? Well, my answer is, what was the tense use intended in the direct discourse? I am going to the store. Was that a futuristic present or was that a progressive present? And whichever it was in the direct discourse, I'm going to identify that as the use in the indirect discourse. No, it sounded to me like you said, you had heard me say the historic present occurs only in direct or indirect discourse?
Indirect discourse.
No. In fact, I don't know that I've ever seen a historic present in either direct or indirect discourse. I see it only in narrative framework. So Mark says, and Jesus is passing through Jericho. So that's a narrative context. I'll be happy to, we can look and see, for example, at the examples that Wallace gives of the historic present in narrative contexts, but okay, so he says the only person in which the historical present occurs is the third person because it occurs in narrative. So, just look here. Examples of legi include, he goes on, Haggai came into his home, the disciples followed him, debatable texts.
So maybe
Now here's a case of before Abraham was, I am. That's direct discourse. And I think he ends up arguing that this is not a case of historic present. He notes here the fact that the present tense follows an aorist infinitive has nothing to do with how it should be rendered. Number two, if it is a historic present, it's the only one in the New Testament that uses the equative verb ami. Okay, and if it is a historical present, it's the only present other than the third person. So I would agree with him. It's not a historical present. Now there is in Jerusalem a pool, John 5. And here he wants to argue that this is a likelihood for a pre-destruction of Jerusalem date for John. But the pool that John talks about was there in Jerusalem, whether the city was destroyed or not. Okay, so I think John is thinking there's a pool in Jerusalem. He's not there himself. He's over at Ephesus or wherever he's at. And now Romans 7. This is a whole different issue. Paul speaks in the first person singular in the present tense. For that which I am doing, I do not understand. Since Paul is speaking in the first person, the historic present label is not at all likely. Now, my response to Wallace's take here has been to say, well, your observation that it occurs in narrative predominantly is accurate. And narrative can be biographical. It can be autobiographical. And what if in the middle of an epistle, Paul goes autobiographical? It then fits the genre constraints that we observe for the historical present. We see Paul in Romans 7, verse 14, and we'll just look at this here. He says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am fleshly, having been sold under sin." Okay. So I'm going to pay attention to the lexical, the grammatical, and the contextual constraints in determining my pragmatic analysis of Paul's statement, "I am fleshly." Contextually, in verses 7 through 13, he's just spent time saying, "I would not have come to know sin except through the law. I was alive once apart from the law." So he already sets up a past referring situation. In the past I was alive, then the law came and I died. Sin, taking opportunity, killed me. And he asks these questions: did the law, that which is good, become death to me? Oh no, it was rather to show the sinfulness of my sin. For we know the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh. Well, why don't we see verse 14 as a continuation of the time frame already established before in verses 7 through 13? A past time frame in which the law encountered him. He saw that he was dead, even though he thought he was alive spiritually. And he's continuing that frame. I am fleshly, in bondage to sin. Okay? So there's a sense in which I don't have to appeal to the historic present when I get to verse 14, because I've already got a temporal framework that's past referring. And he's inside that temporal framework.
So I mean, what kind of present would that be?
Well, I'm gonna call it a historic present, but what I'm saying is I'm not just hanging a label on this verb because it fits my theology. I'm appealing to the immediate context. I'm going to appeal to the broader context of Romans 6 and 8 to show that being sold under sin is not the condition of a believer who is freed from sin, Romans 6 and Romans 8 both. And so theologically and contextually, I can say we have a autobiographical section in an epistle. Paul begins it in the past tense. I was alive. I died, past tense. Sin deceived me, past tense. And then he shifts into the present tense. Now, is it possible that his shift into the present was intending to bring the narrative out of the past into the present? I'll say yes, it's possible. Is it more likely that he's talking about his own present state, or that he's talking vividly about the past. The criteria I use to determine likelihood are theological continuity and consistency across the text, and awareness of this temporal framework. And I think those two things tip the scale. And
what was the last one?
The temporal framework, he's been talking about his life in the past, and what he describes in verses 14 to 25 corresponds to that life.
So this would be kind of for emphasis, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, kind of to bring out the emotion of it, you know, right?
And that's kind of where he ends up. Oh, wretched man that I am. We have reached a heightened emotion.
No, I can see that.
And I'm happy that I'm not alone in this analysis. That there's actually a substantial body of Reformed theologians who understand this passage as referring to Paul prior to being converted, which is one of the reasons why, when I encounter discussions of sanctification in the believer in Reformed contexts, I view appeals to Romans 7 as illegitimate, since they can't even agree with among themselves. And there are Arminians who go the both other way too. So the point is this is not really a Reformed Arminian issue. It's a theological consistency and grammatical analysis issue. So yes, I do call it a historic present, but I don't think that Wallace's objection that it's not narrative literature stands. I think it is narrative. It's autobiographical narrative. And if that's the case, then genre objections are out the window. Okay. So, let me say again, I'm sorry that I miscommunicated before. Historic presence occur outside of direct discourse and outside of indirect discourse, predominantly.
I don't think I'm understanding indirect discourse rightly. I know, direct discourse is someone speaking to another, right? Just
direct quote, yeah.
For instance, help me to understand indirect discourse better, because I think I'm kind of...
Well, you explain to me what you think it is, and then I can maybe clarify that.
Well, it's like a third party, giving sort of what a person says outside of a direct quote. Like I thought that 16 in our quiz would qualify. He touched him and is saying to him.
Well, okay, let's look at Mark 1:41. He touched him and is saying to him, fellow, katharisthe, I am willing, be healed. Okay, fellow katharisthe is what Jesus said. That's a direct quote. Since it's a direct quote, it's direct discourse.
So if he didn't give a direct quote and just said what he said in his own sort of just paraphrase or whatever, would that be indirect discourse?
Indirect discourse could be, for example, and he said, hati, that, no, that's going to be direct discourse. He said, I can't think of how to make this indirect discourse in Greek. You use the infinitive form, thelein, or thelein, me, an accusative pronoun. And then probably another infinitive. I want you to be healed. In English, we would say it, he said he was willing to heal him.
That's what he said he wanted him to.
He said he was willing to heal him.
That's he said he wanted him to be healed.
Yeah, he said he wanted him to be healed. In which case, it would be, what I was saying was right. It would be a form of legi, then an infinitive form of fellow, plus the AGR, plus an infinitive form of katharizo, and the direct object.
Okay, I forgot about the first infinitive stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so indirect discourse. I don't know how to say it better than to say it has, that label has under it two distinct categories of use. Okay. Indirect discourse. One, a report of the speech of another person in the third person. Greek uses the infinitive construction to do this. The second use of indirect discourse is a grammatical construction with either, you know what, I'm probably doing a worse job by typing it out than I would do if I would just grab the BJU handbook. And go back to indirect discourse construction is a dependent clause that reports information indirectly. Since it frequently completes a verb of communication, the construction is called indirect discourse. It is used when discourse is reported indirectly rather than by direct quotation. So that's what I just talked about. That's the first use. Greek grammarians have typically used the term indirect discourse for the same grammatical construction after verbs of seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, and thought. This construction after such verbs is still called indirect discourse because it does express information indirectly, and it still takes the form of a clause rather than a simple direct object. The following example illustrates the difference between a simple direct object and indirect discourse construction. I know you, and I know that you glorify God. Okay, so Greek has several ways of expressing indirect discourse. Gnosko hati doxadzes ton theon. I know that you are glorifying God. What do you know? That you are glorifying God. That's indirect discourse of the second variety.
I'm going to go, as soon as I get back, I apologize about that. As soon as I get back to the office, I'm going to reread that section.
Yeah, so that's the section to, and then you got to remember that there's also indirect discourse with participles. This section doesn't add that because we haven't learned participles at that point.
Yeah, I'll reread this section.
Okay. Well, I think that's good enough for today then. Thank you.